Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origins Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of the origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origins Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hannah Zevin. Dr. Zevin is in both the History and English departments at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a faculty affiliate of the Berkeley Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and on the Center for New Media's Executive Committee. She's a visiting fellow at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Difference. Dr. Zevin's recently published book is entitled The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy. Tonight, Dr. Zevin will talk with us about that work, The Distance Cure, COVID-19, Depression, and Teletherapy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hannah Zevin.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with you. And Patricia, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to do in this pretty Freudian hour of 53 minutes. So I'll begin with Freud. Just over a year after Sigmund Freud and some of his family, including his wife Martha and famously his psychoanalyst daughter Anna, fled Nazi-controlled Austria for London in the wake of the recent Anschluss, Freud's jaw cancer had progressed to a point where it was quote-unquote nothing but torture, and on September 23rd, 1939, he took consecutive doses of morphine to end his life. By the late summer 1940, the British Psychoanalytical Society, hereafter BPAS, had been doubly unsettled. Inside the society, Freud's recent death had left a power vacuum. He could no longer serve as a stabilizing force between disparate factions already formed, in which his own daughter, Anna, fought against Melanie Klein over the future of the technical practice. And outside, in Greater London, as well as much of England, there was nightly siege from the skies, the Blitz. Where World War I had sparked an interest in the crowd and mass psychology, World War II and its aftermath necessitated group therapy and mass therapeutic services, especially for children and veterans. This was a radical departure from how psychoanalytic therapy had been used in the mainstream, and at this point, it was the dominant form of care on offer. Treatment of the group and children were only just emerging as forms of therapeutic work. And in order to reach those in need of help, psychoanalysis therefore underwent a series of revisions delivered by multiple analysts with various technical approaches. Psychoanalysis during the war demanded, at the very least, a rethinking of the following basic tenets of treatment: privacy, the economics of mental health, who and how many can be analyzed and from what distance, what constitutes a session, and where and how sessions can be conducted. Analysts experimented heavily with new techniques that relied on services subscribed to en masse, including the use of quotidian media and technology already highly depended upon because they brought news of the war to the home. Now, one of the most famous child patients during the World War II moment was a 10-year-old boy, Richard, whose treatment Melanie Klein recounted in great detail in Narrative of a Child analysis. The analysis was comprised of some 93 sessions conducted between late April and August of 1941. This was a very short treatment by Klein's standard. And if you're wondering why we're in World War II to talk about the present, just bear with me a moment longer. Klein had been evacuated to Scotland, and Richard had also been evacuated to Scotland, each after a bomb had hit their own homes. But Richard was brought specifically to Scotland in order to begin a treatment with Klein. She was highly sought after. The sessions took place in this little school hut featured here. In Melanie Klein's last session with Richard, his ongoing feelings about the end of their work together, their termination, were by turns both loving and hateful, and they continued right up until the end of the session through play. Richard had been, across this last session, fixated on the clock. He caressed it, he handled it, he opened and closed it, he wound it, and was deeply engrossed in these activities. And then he set the alarm and said, Mrs. K is broadcasting to the world. She is saying, I shall give the right kind of peace to everybody. And then he added a little shyly, and Richard is a very nice boy. I like him. Richard, keenly aware of the number of minutes he has left with his doctor, acts out a fantasy. He could continue to hear Klein after their termination, and others would hear her too. And of course, she would explicitly, over the national broadcast, refer to caring for him particularly. This fantasy is not actually about the continuation of therapy in the traditional sense, not being able to let go. The fantasy is instead that Mrs. Klein loves him and cares for him even when she is separated from him and off the clock. Richard fantasizes that media will provide impossible enduring access to his psychoanalyst when the traditional frame of care, the in-person session, disappears. Wartime anxiety and its solution would both be broadcast and heard in the home, illness and cure coming over the same channel. Klein would provide peace, not just psychologically, but as an end to the war. Richard replaced his anxious-making broadcast of war updates with the comforting voice of his analyst, speaking this idealized content and working to do damage to the war outside by repairing the war inside. Richard could count the raids while also receiving, no matter where Klein was, quote unquote, the right kind of peace psychoanalysis. And the specifics of Richard's fantasy are, of course, his alone, and they're interpretable within the confines of this little boy's treatment. But the media setting for that fantasy, the national broadcast, was actually happening in reality. Psychoanalytic broadcasting had begun to occur with some frequency. And while many of these broadcasts were quite well received, other appearances caused great controversy. Even Richard's own Mrs. Klein did indeed appear on a radio broadcast, urging parents not to forget that their children needed play even in wartime. Most regularly, D.W. Winnicott addressed the nation over the wireless in a series of discussions on mothering beginning in 1939, and they were so successful that they continued until 1962, a wartime necessity translated into a peacetime indispensability. The psychoanalyst, using the ubiquity of private radio ownership and consumption in the home, was performing a kind of house call, and indeed providing it with some consistency, proving reliable in a moment of extended uncertainty, and crucially mobile in a time of restricted movement, much like ours. Winnicott's radio show imagined a new kind of therapeutic help, one that was also advice and psychoanalysis for the public, one reliant on cohesive themes of communal distress at the level of the nation, while simultaneously mimicking an individual treatment conducted in public. But this new kind of method for reaching the public and furnishing the public with some form of psychological care during an apex national crisis was not without its detractors, including Winnicott himself. Winnicott found that this quote unquote good enough treatment was actually not to be recommended, perhaps even during wartime, let alone in the peacetime that presumed to follow. In critiquing his own long-standing experiment and collaboration with the British Broadcasting Corporation, he idealized a pure psychoanalysis, one that would be located in a two-way relationship 5 times weekly, comprised of an idealized kind of attention, and crucially, in a room, bodies together, meeting. While Winnicott discussed the need to be flexible with patients in terms of how and when they're seen, and consistently experimented in his own private practice with the boundaries of what it would mean to see patients, here, talking about his own work with the BBC, he renaturalized a good analysis as one that understood itself as unmediated, again, as pure. Analytic treatment might be flexible, he argued, but it's not productive for it to be that flexible, that mediated. And in hindsight, Winnicott redescribed his broadcasts as emergency measures only, but of course, only having allowed this form of treatment to propagate amongst millions of women. And despite the broadcast continuing for, again, 17 years after the war's end. Winnicott here may sound quite reminiscent of the teletherapy debates that many of us may have come to hear about, or at least be somewhat aware of, ever since psychoanalysis, psychology, and psychiatry all suddenly went remote in March 2020.
How did you come across this example of this little boy? Because it could not be more perfect.
I find Richard extremely moving. My book, which I'll talk about literally on the next slide, is organized across the long 20th century, from Freud's own work with real media and including one child patient through this period I just discussed in brief in World War II. And I've long loved this one. It's a very thick book, like this big, this book of Melanie Klein's about Richard. And in writing, I just recalled that he had this fantasy that this thing that actually was taking place that he didn't know about was indeed happening. And so just brought it in pretty late to the revision of the book. And it really came back to mind significantly at the start of March 2020, including the attention to how we think about what children need, both safety, bodily safety, and the need for play, and how this became a huge parenting debate, which really sort of reminded me significantly of World War II and many of the debates pediatricians and psychoanalysts were having then. This phenomenon was not unique to World War II. Over the course of the 20th century, therapists across the political spectrum and across various approaches to the mind would harness new media, from the radio to the newly ubiquitous telephone and television, to extend the reach of therapy beyond this one-to-one meeting of the consulting room and to follow the patient in waiting wherever they might be lying in wait in crisis. This has also raised time and time again worries about how to preserve the practice, either from being diluted, made less good and then put on offer, or being turned obsolete altogether. Teletherapy is now everywhere, as is crisis. And as it turns out, we are only the most recent group of clinicians, of patients, and of thinkers to be faced with the challenge of how to provide care at distance in the face of great difficulty. What we can already learn from my tiny tour through the effects and efforts of World War II psychoanalysis is that, undoubtedly, another crisis will come. And before that, we will face a crisis called the aftermath, which we're already in, even as the pandemic isn't over. This pattern has emerged again and again, as I was just gesturing at, in my research for my first book, The Distance Cure: History of Teletherapy, which came out last summer from MIT Press. The book makes several interventions via examining the therapist, broadly defined, and the patient working at distance from one another. Globally, it retells the history of clinical psychology via its shadow form, teletherapy. But I argue throughout this book that instead of this being a recent concern, teletherapy, and I'll add telemedicine, have been about to make their grand debut for 100 years or more. Teletherapy is as old as therapy itself. And in the book, I argue, as an example, that Freud was not just the father of psychoanalysis, but the father of teleanalysis as well, both in his so-called self-analysis, which was conducted via letter writing, epistolary contact with his best friend and later enemy, Wilhelm Fliess, and also in a work with a child patient called Little Hans, as well as many other patients, at least for some of the time. The letter carried analytic work. The book then moves on from Freud and takes the extraordinary and vulnerable and intimate relationship between therapist and patient, and it recasts that relationship not as a dyad of two people working together, but as always a triad involving media and technology. And there I explore what forms of intimacy and care, knowable and unknowable, are possible within these other configurations. I make the claim that since Freud stopped laying hands on his patients as part of hypnosis, some intervening distance really has always been present between clinician and patient, even when they work in the room together. Then I proceed to look at how patients and therapists have bridged that distance in order for communication to happen. Mediated, networked, and teletherapeutic relationships physically literalize this separation, even as they work to diminish it. And while the cases I examine in this book are quite different from one another, ending with an early reflection on the pandemic, written in June 2021, I unite them by making the claim that distance isn't the opposite of presence. Absence is. So if tele isn't an absence, we have to pay attention to it and redescribe it. And to do so, my book elaborates various forms of what I call distanced intimacy, the kinds of intimacy only possible when we're not in the room together. And these forms of intimacy not only persist, but are formed on the grounds of distance, something that we've all been much too well acquainted with in the last 2 years. And in the time that remains, about 30 minutes, I'm going to point to how thinking about how these historical examples that I've begun with of teletherapy in crisis and of crisis might give us a different aperture onto the moment we've just lived through and the moment distinctively that we're in now, this kind of both inside the pandemic and a kind of forced aftermath, kind of return to normalcy. So the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic brought with them a second wave, a mental health crisis that also touched everyone. Trauma, thought of as belated coming after, can also be preemptive or apprehensive, a suspended state of knowing that loved ones may die, but not who exactly, or living in fear that oneself might die, but not yet. And that's only the trauma in response to the primary loss caused by COVID-19, now 1 million Americans and more and growing, but not yet only by systemic inequality and their intersection in a more fine-grained way. What will happen to bodies? Not yet the psychological havoc of that systemic oppression, massive job loss, medical debt, and of course, the isolation of social distancing if we were lucky enough to be able to purchase it. Teletherapy has been pointed to as a tool that uniquely could intervene in ameliorating trauma during that period of necessary social distancing. There was widespread support for the switch to teletherapy at almost every level 2 years ago, from private practice to institutions to policymakers, even as it made many practitioners and their patients quite nervous. In the United States, despite the government's COVID-19 policies, or we could also say lack thereof, by March 19th, 2020, 4 of the big 5 insurance companies, Cigna, Empire, Aetna, and Anthem, had all updated their insurance policies to completely cover teletherapy, including all out-of-cost pockets, for a provisional period until June 4th, 2020. And when that date neared, they extended a new policy and then extended it again, rendering talk therapy and CBT essentially free to 130 million Americans for a year. Now, critics of teletherapy often focus on the corporate drive to monetize therapy, and I will return to this, to make it efficient, over the fact that many people would make use of some form of psychological care if it were covered by insurance, if it were affordable, if good practitioners would do it, if it weren't in the hands of corporations, and if there were more practitioners in general, more people could access therapy. And suddenly, forced by COVID-19, these conditions were partially met, however, partially. Recalling Sigmund Freud's famous talk, Lines of Advance in Psychotherapy, at the close of World War I, and in the midst of, I think this is no coincidence, the Spanish influenza pandemic, therapy is no longer, but was just free for most, if not all, in the United States, connected by whatever medium was necessary, including now, of course, the return to in-person, also a necessary medium. But this, in the early moment of the pandemic, included walks, recalling a favorite modality of Freud's, in schoolyards, and on the phone, on Skype, on Zoom, and so on. And some, of course, never left their consulting rooms. And if you want to talk about that, we can. And in the US, that early totalizing shift to tele has, of course, now reverted 26, say, months out, even as everyone is still trying to come to terms with what's just happened and therefore might make use of some therapy as we weather the pandemic and its attendant struggles, as well as the struggles that predated the pandemic that are exacerbated now. And once again, in a moment of crisis, distance is offered often as the intervention and the extension that allows these treatments to function, not just in therapies that are offered via, say, state-run initiatives by private practices that necessarily went digital and haven't all come back to in-person, and from Silicon Valley startups also offering, say, concierge, that's their term, or app-based mental health care delivery, but also forms of care that went beyond the boundaries of paid attention have emerged and addressed themselves to those in crisis under these crisis conditions. This has included local ad hoc social groups and mutual aid networks, which have taken on hyper-local peer-to-peer care, including mental health care and coordinated social activities as a bulwark against loneliness. And unlike any other moment in the history of teletherapy, save for perhaps World War II, which is why I began with it, COVID-19 essentially mandated distance by and large. And so distance became the pharmacon, the disease and the cure at once. And as the early months of the pandemic unfolded, I interviewed many therapy practitioners from a multitude of backgrounds as they switched over to full telepractices, almost all overnight. And one of these workers is also a dear friend, Eric Linsker, who is a social worker and a psychotherapist in group practice in Brooklyn. They had just started working remotely from their apartment with their partner, Laura, who is incidentally also a social worker working in a different psychotherapy practice. Now, Eric texted me one morning between patients, quote, running a remote clinic out of our apartment that keeps us feeling useful, end quote. So I asked Eric how that remoteness was going. And as I said, Eric is a friend of mine, and so had been long skeptical of teletherapy, this thing I was working on. And I knew that when I asked. So I asked them how the remoteness was going. And although they didn't love the screen time, remote therapy was, it turned out, going better than expected. Namely, Eric had been initially a bit concerned about how to work specifically with his child patients, the Richards of 2020. With whom they did play therapy, including art therapy. And so this was a real problem, how to do play therapy and art therapy on Zoom. So Eric's dominant tool in ordinary pre-pandemic face-to-face therapy is, quote unquote, the squiggle game. So I'll explain that in brief, because unless you are a clinician, this is a very particular game. So the squiggle game, an example of which is on the screen, is an innovation of Winnicott's, that same analyst who was broadcasting during World War II and was otherwise deeply experimental in terms of how to work both with children and adult patients. So here's the squiggle game. In essence, it's drawn-free association for children who can't yet verbalize and play with free association in words. So the game is open-ended. Unlike games that ask a child to copy an image or draw a person, the child draws whatever they want. So this was, a real innovation, because it also meant that younger children could make use of it before they could draw, realistic images. So how was my friend Eric supposed to make this work on Zoom? Well, it turned out there was a way to make it work. The whiteboard feature, Eric realized. So both callers on Zoom, when you're not in a webinar, have access to the whiteboard. It's supposed to be used in business meetings or classroom settings, as it allows for things to be annotated up there between two people. But Eric had realized that it was just a remediated piece of paper. A kid could draw on it. A therapist could see it. The work could go on. So the ingenuity and creativity my friend showed, and Eric's commitment to reimagining the frame while holding it, was one of the most moving things I indirectly experienced in those first few days. Where basically everything was a kind of indirect experience, except for what was happening in one's own home. At a moment when the therapeutic frame had massively shifted. Eric had figured out an adaptation to allow for continuity, for holding, for play. And so did Eric's patients. One autistic child came up with his own innovation and began to layer the new digital therapeutic environment, sharing their screen, annotating, chatting, undoing, and redoing all at once, creating a full sensoria to replace the in-person scenario. And of this, Eric said, quote, undo, redo has become the Fort Da of the digital consulting room. But many of these same people, both patients and practitioners, communicated truly a shock at the intimacy that teletherapy can bring. Psychoanalysts especially seemed particularly surprised that there was something more intense about having the patient at an ear's distance rather than at the distance of the couch, and that the patient got surprisingly more inside. So the star of Showtime's Couple Therapy, a great show, which I encourage you to check out, it's very interesting, Dr. Orna Gralnick, who works both with individuals and couples in private practice as well as on TV, feels that it is COVID-19 itself, more than working remotely, which shifted the nature of therapy and of her television show. In its second season, it's both in person and digital, and very fascinating that way. So Gralnick says that the loss of space together was felt acutely. Quote, the work had been surprisingly, shockingly good. People really needed the help. And to be in their home with them and for them to see that I'm at my home is helpful, end quote. Or Bruce Weitzman, an analyst in private practice in San Francisco, said at the time, quote, I feel a closeness that is unusual even for in-person sessions, particularly when I use my noise canceling headset. It feels often as though the patient has been transported into my mind and my mind into theirs, end quote. So therapists think of telecommunication historically across time as increasing distance and then instantaneously crossing it to the point where distance turns into increased access, bordering on telepathy, if we heard Weitzman's sort of idea of what the headphones were doing. So that teletherapy could verge on telepathy was remarked on repeatedly, that speech at a distance added to intimacy rather than subtracting it. And for those lucky enough to have established relationships with mental health practitioners, the switch to these virtual sessions, no matter the medium, was a lifeline, although it was a lifeline requiring major adjustment and presenting real drawbacks. Exhaustion and unease came up for both patients and therapists. While many attributed that exhaustion to quote unquote oppressive screens, a phrase I heard all the time in my research, others wondered if the intensification of intimacy that Weitzman is describing, telepathy, was actually to blame for burnout that practitioners began to report in astrological numbers. And I'll pause here and say, of course, I'm not talking about medical doctors on the front lines in ERs, but some of this also goes too for those who are negotiating switches to telemedicine, not those in the ER. And for that work, I really recommend my colleague, Dr. Jeremy Green's forthcoming book on the history of telemedicine that also deals with the pandemic. It's a really beautiful book I was lucky enough to read early. So to return to teletherapy, it was hardly surprising to me that there was this confusion between the idea of the screen doing something and those who thought, in fact, the intimacy was doing something. But of course, there was a third element here, the misattributed exhaustion that patients were actually bringing in trauma pretty universally to sessions. When we focus on the screen or even the shifts in intimacy, I saw over and over again the occlusion, the forgetting of the fact that we were in a pandemic. So Gralnick argued that it was the extremity of all that was unfolding in those early weeks, not just the shifts in modality or the shifts in intimacy, but the shifts in society that led to exhaustion and the work with each other. Quote, the heat is on in terms of dynamics, end quote. And while not all of the couples she worked with had both members at home full time, some were quote unquote essential workers, many were home and simultaneously dealing with the pressures in their relationships, working full time from home, homeschooling children. And let's not forget that there were also uprisings across the country in the same period, and that this was also part and parcel with many experiences for those in this moment. So therapists that kept a serious boundary between their lives and their practice suddenly had to handle patients seeing the inside of their homes and vice versa. More than one patient remarked on hearing, say, a therapist's child or a dog or a cat, and actually being flooded with intense emotion. Some were able to identify this reaction. The author Hannah Black named it, quote unquote, my loneliness, after Black witnessed the analysts have a child, which enunciated more clearly how alone Black was alone in her apartment. And others were stunned. The essayist Karina Del Valle Shorska described years of fantasizing out loud to her therapist about her therapist concerning her therapist's status as a single woman for years, only one day to have the child of her analyst walk into the teletherapy session. On the analyst side, Goralnik recalls a patient seeing her child's yearbook in the corner of her Zoom screen, which immediately gave real material, concrete information about schooling choices, i.e. class, neighborhood, etc., as well as the child's age. And whereas some reported that these kinds of incursions into privacy were really upsetting or unsettling, others saw them as productive. Others saw them as something that could be worked with, something new, something that was, in essence, a silver lining of teletherapy in the pandemic. And as we'll return to at the end, this literalization of intimacy over distance, in which the patient and the analyst can see both more and differently, is typical. It breaks the frame of any traditional therapy just as much as the inclusion of a digital device does. And the move to the digital was often figured as an impoverishment of information, the loss of rich data, of timbre, of body positioning, of eye contact, of silence. In practice, it actually turned out to be too much, too rich, a different kind of rupture, not so much a loss, but actually an exceeding of capacity.
So what Neil had wanted to know is, why was young Richard in therapy?
That's a great question. So it's a complicated case and a beautiful case for thinking something I'll come to right at the end. So I won't do a spoiler, but I'll return to Richard. Part of it was what was happening inside. You know, this is very much, Melanie Klein has a very particular, and it's still the minor tradition, but I'm very compelled by it, a very particular way of thinking what happens inside and outside someone's psyche, but also out in the world, and how these two things actually interact with each other. So rather than thinking that, you know, the mind is literally just the Oedipal complex or something, right, that's going to have resonance with, say, who's president. So I'll get there. That was part of it. The other thing was that Richard's brother was in the war, and he was made incredibly anxious and had a lot of different symptomatology resulting from that war outside rather than what was only happening inside. And Klein, in their work, wanted to really look at what was happening inside, that she could see based on his reactions to what was happening outside. And I think quite clear from at least what Klein tells us about the end of the treatment is that Richard was helped and really felt at least helped via a new love relationship. Like he really loved their time together. It's a great question, Neil. Thank you.
Vince says, if one talks about teletherapy, shouldn't we also talk about the cause, i.e. teletrauma, whereby a large part of the distressing information likely comes from the media, TV, radio, internet? And if so, what should logically the public health implications be?
Thank you, Vince. I think that's a great question. So as I was just describing with Richard, right, part of the way the anxiety was stirred up for Richard was listening to, you know, these very regularly scheduled BBC broadcasts about the RAF raids, how many bombs were dropped that day, what planes, what was happening on, you know, X front in Germany, et cetera, as the army advanced. And that was terrifying. It was a kind of excess of information. And it also had, as Klein would say, these interior implications. So not just war is horrible, which it is, but also something inside. Okay. So we, of course, see versions of that my colleagues have better than I. It's beyond my own particular frame. Talked about, like Amit Pinchevsky writes a lot about the way the diagnosis of PTSD does not allow for witnessing when it's mediated. PTSD can only come from in-person events, which he really critiques. So I think that we're starting to see that turn to trying to think about the role of, as I'm describing it, the pharmacon, both the poison and the cure having to come over the same channel. And that in the pandemic, for many who were seeking therapy, that this was true, that there was a kind of excess and pain of receiving a deluge of statistics, of dashboards, of videos of George Floyd's murder, on and on and on, and also then supposedly getting their help. The last thing I'll say over the same channel, the last thing I'll say is that this is no better typified than by the kind of Silicon Valley model of appified mental health care, where often these services will offer assistance with digital addiction on the phone. So that of course is something, right, we can think about in terms of the frame of the economics and political economy of such a choice. But I think that there are quite serious answers to your question, and also the most sort of laughable, like the Silicon Valley one, and that much work needs to be done in this area. I think it's a great question.
Ken Walsh says, in teletherapy with a child patient, is a parent in the room? And if so, is there a camera focused on the parent as well for the viewing by the therapist? And also, are the sessions preserved? Are they recorded?
Thank you. This is a great question. So I think I can only answer like generally. So, right, one thing I've learned is basically anything that you can think of has been done. But in general, no. This was a question, right? So in general, children have confidentiality respected in one way, which is that their parents are not in the room. The child is then free to manage that how they can. And it can tell clinicians a great deal about what's happening at home, especially as play is being read. But parents are also being communicated with beyond the session. So there's both in the session a kind of privacy, and then afterwards there's a kind of report. What a number of my colleagues who are clinicians, and again, I am not one, I'm a historian, told me about the challenges the pandemic could present is especially with little kids or little kids who are, acting out. The idea of sitting still in front of a screen, had it been TV, yes, maybe, but for therapy, not so much. The other thing is that, like, say this Zoom quit out and I was a small child, right? I might not know how to get back. I might not even know how to get back as an adult. So then the session has to be interrupted. Mommy, can you come help me? Daddy, can you come help me? On and on and on, which then was very destructive for some kinds of work where actually the child needed to not be so dependent on the parent or such and so forth. But I've never heard of sessions being recorded that way on Zoom. There are other histories of recorded therapies, which are part of the teletherapy history, but I've not heard of that in the recent pandemic. But yeah, it's changed the dynamics of how much the parent is both in, quite materially, but also fantasizedly. The parent is through the room, through the wall. They're nearby, even if they're not actually present. And that changes things. Here's a child. So before the pandemic, across the therapeutic landscape, reactions to teletherapy were on a foundational level about a fantasized freedom from mediation, the purity of two bodies together in a room. And so now I want to turn to some of my findings that I come to at the end of the pandemic, at the end of this first phase of the pandemic, 2 years, and what the critiques of teletherapy were before the pandemic and how it can help us re-see what's taken place over the last 2 years. So the reaction against technology in the therapeutic scene is, I argue, a reaction against the intrusion of any unknown third and its effects on communication that it makes possible. So now that we're in the US context, a pretty ongoing, seemingly semi-permanent pandemic condition, right, where we just have surge after surge after surge. So again, my apologies for having to have rescheduled this talk, for indeed I did myself have COVID. one complicated yet again by variance and various forms of state abdication from counting and supporting those who are sick. The overwhelming need for mental health care doesn't mean that teletherapeutic modalities should be exempt from critical consideration, even as rates of depression and anxiety have indeed skyrocketed in this time. So as I turn to the critiques of teletherapy, I'll just walk through the key ones, I think, most important ones that inflected my thinking. Most critiques of teletherapy center around this body. And again, they make this mistake where they think the body at distance is an absent body. And these critiques tend to go like this. You need the body to be in the room because embodiment, being together, does things. And that is certainly true. It's undeniable. There are effects that come from being together. There are also effects that follow from being apart. These critiques think of the effects that follow from being apart as a lessening, as a loss, as a dampening. And for many, they can be in general. But in teletherapy, it's quite different. So it's not possible to just think about, a Zoom cocktail hour versus an in-person cocktail hour. Right? There's something else happening when it's therapeutic. So Sherry Turkle, Jillian Isaacs Russell, and Todd Eisig write of the importance of being together physically in the therapeutic context. And they argue that there's power and intimacy in, quote, nonverbal communication, of eye contact, of smell and gesture and touch, end quote. And they really think that this is the basis for trust. For each patient, the meanings of liveness, distance, and of coming together are being held apart, and of those situations being dictated, which they were, as opposed to chosen, are all relevant for therapeutic treatment that at all contends with the psyche, which not all therapeutic treatment does. And this critique is not just focused on the workings of therapy, but also human empathy. Again, it's absence, it's loss. That's the total narrative. Distance is thought of as absence, and I argue it's not. This subset of critiques is actually often evidence-based. Say, screen-based communication has been proven to lower empathy scores, along with a whole other host of psychological problems. This goes back to, I think, Vince's question that we just had. If the work of therapy is to produce a more feeling, in-touch, empathetic subject, then they go, how can screen-based teletherapy not be antagonistic to the very aims of treatment, as I just described it? But empathy, which is held up as an eternal ethical value, it's one we impart to children, when we chastise ourselves and others for failing to manifest, is actually, following the arguments of many people smarter than I, part and parcel with certain structures of racism, of misogyny, of classism, of ableism. And I think that this became even more substantiated during the pandemic, where empathy actually only exists on a spectrum of failure. True empathy is impossible. And I'll pause here to say empathy has a fascinating history. It's actually a term that was developed in a lab. It's not a kind of longstanding human emotion. So I can send out a little essay I wrote about this strange history of empathy, and I'm really thinking about it in its like kind of clinical meaning rather than as a kind of synonym for being good-hearted or something. So when empathy succeeds, its success is defined by failure. As Saadia Hartman writes, empathy, quote, fails to expand the space of the other, but merely places the self in its stead, end quote. So there's a kind of doubling. I'm both me and I'm you, rather than you getting to be you. So following Hartman and others, it's not only white or male saviorism that's a likely outcome of what passes for successful empathy, but empathy's failure allows for the categorical denial of humanity. Empathy is then maybe the wrong goal for therapy. Maybe we should be trying to do something else. And perhaps a more radical feeling, or echoing Foucault's call for a, quote, new relational mode, might be something like solidarity, working and respecting each other across difference rather than needing to occupy the difference of the other. And as Leo Borsani, who recently died, writes, quote, there is no solution easily recognizable as political to the political horrors, because no recognizably political solution can be durable without something approaching a mutation in our most intimate relational system. end quote. So I would argue empathy is not a mutation. It's the norm. It's the thing we're already doing and not succeeding at. And so the last genre of teletherapy critique is a little less theoretical and much more material, which concerns commerce, capital, and what's frequently referred to as big tech, sometimes spoken of as the neoliberal turn in mental health care. And I advance this critique in my book, The Distance Cure. In short, algorithms are not neutral. Neither are corporations. Corporations that make use of algorithmic treatment of patients and clients expose those users to all kinds of vulnerabilities, biases, and mistreatment, furthering inequalities via the hiving off of some from access, or what I would call medical redlining, following the tradition of thinking racialized redlining. And Todd Isaac says, quote, "There's a differentiation taking place in the therapy world between people who are doing whatever they can to make it work and be helpful, and those who are viewing this as an opportunity to promote a particular product to sell. There is an assumption among some of the mental health technology entrepreneurs that this, the pandemic, will result in an explosion of the products they're selling," end quote. And this can actually even be true where algorithms are used by nonprofits staffed by volunteers. The Crisis Text Line is just one example, is a leading suicide intervention nonprofit in the US, which at the start of COVID-19 reacted to the increase of anxiety and depression by placing calls for more and more volunteers. And in the pandemic, almost immediately in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, ousted its CEO, Nancy Lubin, for publicly fostering a racist and abusive environment, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of its volunteer crisis counselors by race and ethnicity, where white counselors were understood to be, quote unquote, better practitioners. More recently, the same group was taken to task by the FCC for selling the data of their callers for profit. Their users who are 50% under the age of 18. No amount of technologization or lay mental health care is protection against human bias rather than digital, and that human bias's presence in digital tools. So this group of critiques the effects of disembodiment, the destruction of empathy, and the overwhelming presence of neoliberal big tech at every level is not just leveled at teletherapy. These broad strokes of critique are leveled at anything mediated and technologized in a moment where media are under intense scrutiny, and as they should be, especially those that involve screens. The assumption is before and during and maybe after, for another fear in this moment, is that all things that have gone online, like this talk, will never, ever get to come back off. Although I'm really glad to hear from Patricia, you're trying to move back in person, that teletherapy will be done over Zoom by phone rather than phone. That the absence of bodies, the absence of empathy actually becomes attached to the presence of screens rather than, say, other forms of mediation. So these critiques of teletherapy sometimes confuse symptom for cause. The problem with contemporary human relations is not actually the screen, or not primarily the screen, or not only the screen. I would not argue that the screen has no effects, nor that it's inherently good, certainly not. But the critiques I've just named specifically are leveled at screen-dependent relations, and these critiques are themselves a screen. Screens don't destroy empathy. They host its contemporary loss, which is an effect of despair, of loneliness, and alienation, or depression. These three words are not synonymous, and all three have been at play in COVID-19 because they always are and have been over at least the last 600 years or so. Each has its own connotations, its own lineage, its own history, from the Christian feeling of God's grace leaving, which is despair, to the behavioral and quantifiable, loneliness or depression, to that Marxist diagnosis, alienation, which is the result of economic conditions, but also an emotion. And all three or four of these feelings are attributed now to mediated encounters, even as they deeply predate, and I'm sad Jonathan's not here, the expert on the history of depression, as they deeply predate the start of the pandemic by hundreds of years or more. Despair, loneliness, and alienation didn't start with a pandemic, and they obviously haven't receded during it. They've only increased. Teletherapy cannot address or fix that which is systemic. It addresses and ameliorates the individual, not the crisis, even if it attends crisis, becomes available in crisis, and is used as a tool in crisis conditions. Screens, too, are a human part of human relations. Anything can travel and will travel across them. Violence and trust, empathy and its lack, or a ratio of the two. Connection and disconnection, presence and absence. I contend that this feeling structure associated with teletherapy, with that extraordinary version of an ordinary communicative relationship, functions as a litmus test for the possibilities of relating over distance, a distance which is currently everywhere and what we're doing right now. So in my work, I want to be able to think about these critiques, not just in terms of numerical study, but also psychoanalytically and materially. Where do they come from? So now I will briefly return to Melanie Klein to end, who elaborated a scheme through which to theorize the social in the individual and the individual in the social, a formulation she called the Hitler inside. So for Klein, this meant that there was something in her patients and in herself too that rhymed or identified with that fascist leader, that there was a murderous and tyrannical internal object. So whether that's a horrible father, a facet of self, and so on, that was acted on and exacerbated by the external rhyme with the present social landscape. Michal Shapira, in her book, The War Inside, extended that formulation beyond Hitler to the entire scene of World War II. And starting in 2016, some psychoanalysts even reformulated this as the Trump inside, right? Where kind of coming out, and you can see the kind of rise of attendant fascism related to the Trump inside. So in 2022 now, I like to think through the social and the individual and the individual and the social via a different crucial version of Klein's paradigm, the medium inside. And I'll end here by asking, what would it do to our conception of teletherapy to think of the medium inside rhyming with our methods for communicating at a distance? So many of our fears and complaints about Zoom therapy and also in general Zoomified life have to do with that exhaustion it seems to bring on, that digital exhaust, the metallical, disengaged quality of the medium. And generally, we do not also treat these qualities as possibly coming from within. We think of Zoom as material and technological, and that's it. It has a bad interface. I don't like it, that kind of thing. This poses a real limit for thinking about how teletherapy, and I'll add mediated communication more generally, works on us and works from within us. The medium inside is a less obvious site of identification. Instead of an identification with, say, Hitler, the medium inside provokes and evokes all kinds of early internal affects. If one is at the mercy of feeling, say, dropped because one wasn't held as a child, and here I mean psychologically, not physically, although that too, it's going to be much harder to withstand the glitching of Zoom or the call dropping at that inopportune moment when one passes out of the range of a cell phone tower. And many analysts remarked on this, that their patients would say again and again, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?" before turning to scenes where they were not heard in childhood, quite painfully. And that this rhyme became a kind of recognition, and I'm just trying to name it. So I'm not arguing that the medium inside or outside take precedence over the social inside outside, but instead that we think them together. And as I've argued in my book, the history of human sciences in general haven't really attended to the media by which these forms of care have been conducted. There's been resistance to thinking about anything as entering into that therapeutic scenario beyond the two people involved. So the move to teletherapy en masse during the pandemic confronted therapists, but also historians, with a sudden rupture, one that has led them to consider this sudden intrusive third. But there's also a problem with excessively featuring the medium as a primary source of difficulty in the teletherapeutic encounter, because after all, everything is always dynamic. It's always a patient, a clinician, and a medium together producing whatever they do wherever they can to meet each other wherever they are.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.